Welcome to today's public lectures on Big History and Student Conference on Humanity, Sustainability, and Artificial Intelligence, an extended event of the Big History and Collective Learning 2017 and to 2016 project. My name is Angel, and Year 2 student majoring in Environmental Management and Technology at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology.
And I'm Celine, a member of the Hong Kong Academy for Gifted Education, who's currently studying Form 5 in Dawson Girls' School.
Starting in 2016 to 17, the Big History and Collective Learning Project aims at introducing local students to Big History and has been organizing a series of talks for enriching students with multidisciplinary knowledge. As an extended event of the project, today we are honored to have Professor David Christian to give a public lecture on Big History. Professor David Christian was invited to interact directly with educators and students in Hong Kong by Hong Kong Academy for Gifted Education and the Division of Environment and Sustainability of HKUST. A few days ago, on 26th of September, excuse me, I'm a little bit nervous. Okay. Professor David Christian also delivered a lecture which was jointly organized by the HKUST Jockey Club Institute for Advanced Study.
Today's event is co-organized by Advanced Learning Experiences Division of the Hong Kong Academy for Gifted Education and the Division of Environment and Sustainability of the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. The event is also supported by the Center for the Development of the Gifted and Talented of the Hong Kong UST and Department of History of Hong Kong Baptist University. To express our gratitude for the support from different sectors, now we would like to invite the organizers of this event to present the souvenirs. May Professor T.K. Ng, the Executive Director of the Hong Kong Academy for Gifted Education, and Professor Alice Lau, the Professor of Division and Environment and Sustainability of the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, to come up to stage and present the souvenirs. Next, please welcome our guest speaker, Professor David Christian, the Director of Big History Institute and Distinguished Professor in Macquarie University, to receive the souvenir.
Keeps falling.
Please stay on stage. Now we would like to invite the supporting organization representatives from Hong Kong Baptist University to come on stage and take a group photo. May we please invite Professor Clara Ho, the head and professor of Department of History of Hong Kong Baptist University, please. Thank you all, and please be seated.
So far, we have mentioned the phrase Big History a few times already. So what is it about and why is it crucial to us? Today, we will have Professor David Christian to give a talk on Big History so that we can have a better understanding of this influential concept. So Professor David Christian is a Distinguished Professor of Modern History and a Director of the Big History Institute at Macquarie University in Sydney. For many years, he taught the Russian and Soviet history, and since 1990s, he has also taught courses in World History and Big History. With the support from Bill Gates, he helped create and free online classes for the high school students. The courses is called the Big History Project. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor David Christian.
Okay. Okay, is this microphone working? Can you hear me at the back? I have a cold, so forgive the fact that my voice is a bit croaky. I'm going to get this chair out the way. Okay. So, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real privilege. This sounds like a wonderful institution, this school. And I'm delighted to hear that you already have an interest in big history, and I believe some of you already know quite a lot about it. So I hope what I say today is interesting. I'm going to be trying to summarize some of the main ideas in big history. But one of the central ones is summarized in this quote by a very famous German quantum physicist, Erwin Schrödinger. Schrödinger was a quantum physicist who had some interesting ideas about life. But he was nervous writing a book about life because he thought knowledge is divided into disciplines, and I'm a physicist, so I shouldn't be talking about biology. But he thought, if we don't try to talk across the disciplines, then we will simply look at the world through silos. We need a kind of coherent vision. We need to try to look at the whole of knowledge. And that's what big history tries to do. So this is what Erwin Schrödinger argued. We have inherited from our forefathers the keen longing for unified, all-embracing knowledge. I think of that as going to the mountaintop of knowledge and looking down across all the different disciplines and starting to see how they are linked. And then he goes on to say the very name given to the highest institutions of learning reminds us that from antiquity and throughout many centuries, the universal aspect has been the only one to be given full credit. So this is an argument about the importance of specialist knowledge on the one hand, but secondly, of trying to get an overview of the whole of knowledge, and that's what big history tries to do. Now, let me give an outline of the talk, a sort of map so you know where we're going. It's about a type of curriculum that I think may be particularly appropriate for gifted students and for what I call framework learners. I think I was always a framework learner. By that I mean that if someone tried to teach me something, I needed to know what was the larger frame that that piece of knowledge belonged to. If they didn't tell me the frame, then I couldn't understand it. So in some ways I was a very bad student. But if someone gave me a big framework, then I could understand things. So big history is wonderful if you're a framework learner. And I'm guessing that many of you in the audience today are framework learners, so I hope you'll find it exciting. So part one is about the idea of a modern origin story, which is one way of describing what big history is trying to do. In part two, I will try to give an outline of that story, just very quickly. So I'll be covering 13.8 billion years in about 10 minutes, okay? In part three, I'll be asking, what is the place of humans and today's world in a modern origin story? Many people fear that if you talk about 13.8 billion years and the whole universe, humans will start to look ridiculously insignificant. It's not true, as we'll see. Humans look extraordinarily interesting, and you can see what makes them interesting more clearly on the scale of big history. And fourth, I want to talk about the status of big history today. What have we achieved? How far has big history gone? So those are the four parts of this talk. So first, the idea of a modern origin story. Let me explain what I mean. My latest book is called Origin Story. I believe some of you may have already had a chance to look at that book. So let me explain why I use that phrase. What are origin stories? Well, this is what I mean by origin story. You may get different definitions elsewhere. As far as we know, all human societies, and I mean all human societies, going back 200,000 years, have told origin stories. And what I mean by that is what they have done is they try to assemble all the knowledge of that society, all its knowledge about ethics, about politics, about animal migrations, about the stars, about the climate. And they try to put all of that knowledge together and make it available for younger people, for new generations. So what that does is create a sort of map of space and time, so you know how you fit into your community, how you fit into the world, the landscape, how you fit into the cosmos. And these origin stories are kind of distilled examples of all knowledge, and they can be taught to everyone. They bring together the best knowledge of each society. You can find origin stories in indigenous traditions, in Australian Dreamtime stories. You can also find them in all the great religious traditions. They all contain some sort of origin story. And they provide a sort of map of the universe so that you can place yourself. You can say, this is where I am. This is what I belong to. This is the sort of world that made me. This is the sort of universe I belong to. And doing that is very powerful for our understanding of what we are. But modern schools today don't teach an origin story that comes out of our society. And I will argue that that is a very dangerous thing, and it makes it very difficult to see some very important things that we need to see. And that's why I think we need big history. Let me try to explain why this sort of mapping is so important. And let me begin with the French sociologist Émile Durkheim. In the 19th century, he wrote a book about suicide. Why do some people try to kill themselves? And he argued that one of the problems was what he called anomie. That is to say, they don't know what it is they are part of. They don't have a kind of big map that helps them place themselves in the universe. And this can create a sense of despair, a sense of directionlessness, a sense of purposelessness that can drive people to suicide. And in the 20th century, in a world without origin stories, we've seen plenty of that sense of purposelessness. So this is what origin stories can do. Now, this is a very simple diagram, but I hope it conveys what I'm trying to convey. We all are aware of ourselves as a self, as an individual. We're also aware of ourselves as members of a family. But beyond that, we're aware that we're a member maybe of a village or a clan or a workplace or a school, a larger institution. So that's something else we're part of. Beyond that, we're all aware of being members of a nation. You may think of yourself as a Hong Konger or as Chinese, or in my case, I was born in the US, so am I American, but I live in Australia, but I grew up in England, I don't know what I am. But we all talk about national identities in today's world. And in fact, in schools, we talk about national identities all the time. Almost every history course is about national identities. And personally, I don't think that's a very smart way of teaching in a world with nuclear weapons. Because what it conveys is the idea that my first loyalty is to my people, and if it comes to a war, so be it. Let's all blow ourselves up. That's not a very good idea. So we teach these national identities, but beyond that, there's another identity that we don't talk about that much, and that's our identity as human beings. And in a global world with nuclear weapons and big problems that need to be solved by people coming together around the world, it's this human identity we need to understand better. And we need to understand that humanity as a whole has an origin story, it has a history that's as exciting as any national history. But that's hard to see, but it's one of the things that big history can teach. Beyond that, we are a member of a community of living organisms, billions of them. This community has existed for 4 billion years. It produced us. We evolved out of this community. Our lives are embedded in the community of the biosphere, of planet Earth. We are part of planet Earth. And beyond that, of course, there's a universe and a cosmos. Now, every origin story has a mapping something like this. I belong to this community, to this landscape, and it'll tell you where the cosmos came from, what form it takes, and so on. But to understand this, and I hope, by the way, that that gives you some sense of how an origin story can help you place yourself in the universe, see yourself as something larger. But to do this, of course, it's no good just staying within one discipline. You can't do that mapping if you spend your entire life saying, I'm a psychologist, I study psychology. Psychology is great for understanding the self, the individual, but you need sociology and anthropology to understand small groups. You need history to understand larger groups. You need biology to understand the biosphere. You need the earth sciences to understand the planet, planet Earth, and you need astronomy and cosmology to understand the rest. So to do this kind of mapping, you need to cross many, many disciplines. And this is just one simple way of describing what big history tries to do. Okay, now, let me try and explain the history of big history. I've already said that, as far as we know, all human societies, except for modern human society, have taught origin stories. I called my book Origin Story partly as a reminder that this is not a new project. It's actually a very old project. It's a project that we sort of lost sight of a century ago. In the 18th century, in the European Enlightenment, philosophers and thinkers began to think about a new type of origin story. This was an origin story based on science. They were very excited by the scientific revolution and the achievements of people like Isaac Newton in the 17th century. So they started thinking, could we build a new origin story that's not based on ancient texts or on faith or on revelation, but on science? That's a project that began in the 18th century, and all the great thinkers of the 18th and 19th century were engaged in that project. Can we create a sort of modern origin story? And so this idea of a modern origin story was alive and well in the late 19th century. Hegel, Comte, Alexander von Humboldt, Spencer, Marx, all of these people were involved in trying to create a unified science-based idea of understanding of reality. But then the project vanished. It vanished about 100 years ago, and it vanished so decisively that most of us now are used to a very different world, a world in which knowledge is broken up into specializations, and not a world in which we don't see the unity of knowledge. Now, why did that happen? Big history is an attempt to return to this project. So why did the project vanish in the 19th century? Two quick reasons. First, the science wasn't quite good enough in the 19th century. We knew a lot about the world, but there were so many gaps that they got filled in. So in the 19th century, these big systems began to look like ideologies rather than science. So think of Marxism as an example. Marx was trying to tell a modern origin story, but there were so many gaps that it turned into an ideology rather than science. And secondly, there was so much knowledge that it made sense to break knowledge into disciplines. So in the early 20th century, the world, everywhere, schools, universities, research institutes, they entered this new knowledge world of specialization, in which knowledge meant specialist knowledge. If I'm an expert, I know a lot about this, and no one tries to embrace the whole thing. So I'm a specialist. I was a specialist in the drinking habits of 19th century Russian peasants. That was my specialization. And that was normal in this world of specialization. So we lost the idea of an origin story. And we entered a fragmented intellectual world. And many people indeed said, this is just the way modernity is. If you live in the modern world, you don't have an origin story. Now, I think that's wrong. I think what's been happening in the 20th century is that slowly, an origin story has been emerging within modern science. And now we're ready to start seeing that origin story. And that's what big history does. The disciplines worked very successfully. They accumulated a lot of information, so much information, that now, today, we can start putting it all together and creating a rigorous modern origin story. The science is so much richer. We have so much more information that we can tell this story well. To give one example, we can now give dates for events that happened before there were any humans to write records. We can do this because of radiometric dating, which appeared in the mid-20th century. So the science is so much better now. So that's why we can return to this project today. Forgive my voice. Okay, so how do you put together a modern origin story? Well, it's not that easy. In a world of specialist disciplines, it's not that easy. I'm a historian. I think of it as a bit like quilt making. So what I did was I talked to the cosmologists, or I read their books, I talked to the geologists, I talked to the biologists, I talked to the anthropologists. Each of them had a story. And then, like a quilt maker, I tried to put all of those stories together, and I thought, great, if I put them all together, we'll get a coherent modern origin story. And I thought this would be fairly simple. In fact, it didn't quite turn out like that. I first started teaching big history in 1989 at Macquarie University. This is a picture of me telling this story in Tianjin in September 2014. So what we did was we invited lecturers from many disciplines. I invited astronomers and geologists and chemists and biologists. And they were fabulous. They gave fabulous lectures. But the problem was each of them used their own jargon. They had their own questions. They had their own paradigms. They had their own methods. So the geologists, for example, started talking about metamorphic and igneous rocks. And my history students had no idea what they were talking about. So each discipline told its own story, and the stories didn't seem to connect. So I was a bit depressed. I thought, this is not working. But the students, actually some of the older students said to me, okay, David, this is a mess, this course. This is really not working, but please keep doing it. Because we love the project of trying to bring everything together. So we kept going. And then something magical happened. I don't know if any of you remember working in an old-fashioned photographic darkroom. You take a piece of photographic paper, you expose it to a negative, you put it in a chemical, and then what happens is a white piece of paper, suddenly an image appears magically. And that's sort of what happened to me. Over several years, I listened to all of these lectures, and slowly, a coherent story began to emerge. And eventually I realized there is a modern origin story. It takes a lot of work to put it together and to see the coherence, but it does exist. And that's the story I try to tell now in big history courses. So, part two. What I'd like to do is give you a sort of 10, 15-minute summary of 13.8 billion years. Now, let me stress, this is the way I tell the story. I think there may be different ways of telling it. It's not the only way of telling the story, but this is my best attempt to tell the story.